This next section is going to be about the Roaring Twenties through the Jazz Age. Urbanization and modernization. So in 1920, we hit a landmark in American history where more people actually lived in the cities than lived in the rural areas. So in 1920, the U.S. Census first reported that there were more Americans living in an urban setting than a rural one. Anyway, the same thing. After World War I, we had a major problem. Our factories were all basically designed at that point for making instruments of war, for making the tanks and the bullets and the guns and all that. Well, there was no more war. So we have to rip out all that old machinery and retool the factories so that way we can make consumer goods for people to buy here in America. So we stopped making tanks and we started making Model Ts. We stopped making bullets and we start making toasters instead and stuff like that, okay? This caused massive unemployment during the early 1920s and late teens. But as soon as they got the factories retooled, it took about 2 years, then the job market just took off and we had the Roaring Twenties, which was one of the best times in American history as far as the economy goes. One group that did not benefit were farmers, since they were overproducing, and overproducing crops make the crop prices fail. Now, one major man, a robber baron, if you will, or a captain of industry, stands up and he shows us how it's done. And that is Henry Ford. And he did not invent the car. He didn't even invent the assembly line. He just perfected it. He made that the way that cars are made. So you could have highly unskilled workers, these people that didn't know how to do much. You teach them to do one little job and they do it 1,000 times a day, and all of a sudden we're building cars eventually at a rate of about a car every, I think it was every 30 seconds was rolling off the end of a Ford factory. So anyway, he cut costs through mass production. That got a car price from $10,000 to $300, and millions of Americans bought cars, and it significantly changed American culture after that. We were definitely a car culture, and we're not going backwards, folks. So after he was successful doing this, other manufacturers also copied this assembly line style, and it revolutionized all of U.S. manufacturing. At a certain point, folks, we were making more goods than any other country, and actually we were making more goods than most other countries put together. All right, use the quote. How did Henry Ford apply his philosophy to his business practice? There is one rule for the industrialist: make the best quality of goods possible at the lowest possible cost, or lowest cost possible, paying the highest wages possible. So what he's doing is he's keeping his skilled laborers by paying them twice as much as anybody else. He's paying them $5 a day. So let's see. A's looking pretty good right here by hiring highly skilled workers to ensure quality. Yeah, that's going to be it, y'all. That's the correct question. I mean, the correct answer, excuse me. Right here for question 32. All right. Let me just check the focus real quick. Yeah. All right. So mass production greatly increased the availability of consumer goods. Business encourages Americans to spend money instead of saving them. They were basically saying, why are you waiting to get the house and the car and the toaster and the washing machine? Buy it all now on credit and just pay it off. This is the Roaring Twenties. It's going to become the Roaring 30s. Of course, they had no idea the Great Depression was coming. So the U.S. shifts from coal to electricity as we have cheap hydroelectric power and other sources of electricity, and coal was a big one. They're going to burn coal to produce electricity. So electricity becomes our major source of energy, bringing an age of labor and labor-saving devices. We're going to talk about a couple of heroes from the 1920s right now. We've got Charles Lindbergh. He is the first man to ever fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. I think it took him like It took him about a day, if I'm not mistaken. In entertainment, we have baseball and Babe Ruth. Okay, he's going to be the big guy there. His home run record, basically, it lasted for decades. We now have the ability in the 1920s to have our first talkie movie. So the jazz singer, jazz was the most popular music of the 1920s in America. So what we basically did was we made a movie about the most popular music. And it's a very racist show. It's called The Jazz Singer. I don't recommend watching it. It's pretty boring. But if you want to, that's up to you. By the 1930s, roughly by the 30s, 1/3 of all homes had a radio. Back then, all your furniture was pointed at the radio. People would rush home from school to listen to the Superman radio program and other things like that later on. In jazz music, we have Louis Armstrong. He is the greatest influence on jazz out of anybody from the 1920s. Louis was a trumpet player, and he played other instruments as well, but he's mostly noted for his work with trumpets. The suffragette movement kicks off around this time, and they wanted the 19th Amendment, which is women's right to vote, and they're going to get that, folks. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, and women get the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt replaces Susan B. Anthony as the primary leader of the women's rights movement, and President Woodrow Wilson helped to obtain the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Now, this one is a little bit of a lie, and if you paid attention this year, you would probably know why, okay? Who was actually in charge in the last 2 years of President Wilson's term whenever the 19th Amendment was passed? And the answer is it was his wife, Edith Wilson. President Wilson had had a stroke while he was out there talking to the people, and Edith Wilson was illegally made the President of the United States, but not officially. All right, how did African Americans and women ultimately receive the right to vote? Well, black men get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. Remember the Civil Rights Amendments, 13, 14, 15, free citizens vote. So freedom for all black people, citizenship for everybody except for Indians, and then the 15th Amendment is black men get the right to vote. Well, women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So the only one that's possible is constitutional amendments. The 15th and the 19th Amendment were passed to get black men and all women the right to vote. All right, this one has nothing to do with the notes, so it's just one of those skill questions. For an in-depth research paper on the history of women's suffrage, it would be most helpful to use what? Okay, what should we use for a research paper about women's suffrage? Let's go through each one. Primary sources like speeches and newspaper articles. That sounds pretty good, okay? Secondary sources like an encyclopedia or textbooks. Well, that sounds pretty good too, actually. If you're doing an in-depth research report. Let's see. Primary sources like private correspondence of politicians. That is way too specific, folks. We're doing a research report, okay? Let's see. Secondary sources like biographical sketches of historical figures. That's a little too generic, okay? So I would go with A, okay? The speeches and the newspaper articles as well, okay? So there you go. All right, moving on. We have the Scopes monkey trial. This is one of the big 5 court cases that you must know the details to. John T. Scopes was an atheist, and he was also a scientist. He believed that God was not real, okay? And he believed that we all came from monkeys. He totally believed Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Well, Tennessee was a very, very Christian state at that time, and they did not want evolution taught in class at all. It was illegal. And so John T. Scopes and some other atheists want to challenge that law so that way evolution can be taught all throughout America. So he goes to the local precinct there, the police station, and he tells them, today I'm going to be teaching about evolution. I want you to come arrest me. And so the cops show up, and sure enough, when he starts teaching about evolution, They arrest him. And this court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and it becomes the trial of the century. And that's only going to be changed after O.J. Simpson's trial in the 1990s. But for the rest of the century, this was the biggest trial ever. And it all boiled down to, what are we going to teach our children? Are we going to teach them that God created the earth in 6 days and he rested on the seventh? That's called creationism. Or are we going to teach them that we all came from monkeys and evolved slowly over time? Well, in this court case, okay, let's see, in reality, the trial represented a conflict between traditional values and scientific modern America. So, let's see what the question says. The Scopes trial, 1925, was closely followed by Americans. The trial highlighted many issues beyond the question of whether John Scopes had taught the theory of evolution to high school students. Which issue was not highlighted by the Scopes trial? Okay. All right, separation of church and state. That sounds pretty good. Regional differences, yes. Okay, I'll take that. Freedom of speech, absolutely. Freedom of assembly, okay. The Scopes trial has nothing to do with a bunch of people coming together to protest or anything like that. So I would have to say D is going to be the correct answer there.